Welcome back to CUIN 4320. Good job completing the discussion assignment for week 1. It was good to learn a bit about each and every one of you. Now that we have familiarized ourselves with the domains and competencies of the ESL Educator Standards Program of Texas, it's time to dive right into one of the most critical concepts of language instruction. Welcome to Module 2, Second Language Acquisition. This week and next week we will be reading from the book Between Worlds, Access to Second Language Acquisition by David Freeman and Yvonne Freeman. This week we will read Chapter 5. This video seeks to highlight certain critical parts of the reading.
To begin my presentation this afternoon by talking about what I think is the most important issue in language education, the most important question, and that is, how do we acquire language? And I'd like to...
This chapter seeks to answer two fundamental questions. How do people learn? And how do people acquire language? Before we can understand how people acquire a second language, we must first understand how people acquire their first language and how people learn in general. The chapter begins by briefly introducing 4 theories of how people learn. The first theory is one you all hopefully already know. It was formulated by Lev Vygotsky, a Russian psychiatrist who died young at the age of 37, before he became recognized around the world. In 1978, he introduced the concept of the Zone of Proximal Development, or ZPD, which has since been universally accepted as fact by educators around the world. If you have never heard of the Zone of Proximal Development, read this section carefully. The other introduced theories are personal invention and social convention by Kenneth Goodman and Yetta Goodman, spontaneous concepts versus scientific concepts, also by Lev Vygotsky. This guy's an educational hero if you haven't already noticed already. And Cognitive Apprenticeships by John Seeley Brown, Alan Collins, and Paul Duquette. Pay special attention to these 4 general learning theories, as they are required for the first question in your discussion assignment this week.
So suppose you had an organism that wasn't equipped to learn the words of human language, and you really had to teach it those words by training. Well, you'd first have to define a word. What is the meaning of table, for instance? Nobody can do that.
You have to define the definition you're using to define the word.
But you see, what we call definitions are not definitions. They're just hints. If you take the Oxford English Dictionary, the one you read with a magnifying glass, and they give you a long, detailed thing, which they call the definition of a word. In fact, it's very far from a definition of a word. It's a few hints that a person who already knows the concept can use to understand what's going on. But remember, the child is picking that up not from the Oxford English Dictionary with its whole array of hints. The child's picking it up from seeing it used once or twice. Now, that can only mean one thing. It can only mean that the concept itself, in all of its richness and complexity, is somehow sitting there, waiting to have a sound associated with it.
Whenever the topic of language learning comes up, the name Noam Chomsky is never far behind. A linguist, philosopher, and cognitive scientist, Chomsky is considered to have instigated the cognitive revolution with his theories on human language acquisition. Perhaps best known for his theory on universal grammar, which will be further explored in next week's reading, he is also known by making distinctions between the terms competence and performance. In terms of oral language learning, someone's competence is what a student can do in an ideal setting, whereas someone's performance is what the learner actually does in different situations. The idea behind this distinction is to inform teachers that external factors may be influencing student performances and may not always be a good reflection of a student's competence. The last item I want to discuss in this overview are the differences between grammatical competence and communicative competence. Grammatical competence is the goal of traditional ESL classes. Areas such as phonology, morphology, and syntax fall into this category of competence. However, second language acquisition theories and common sense suggest that a second competence is also needed to be able to function within a new culture and a new language. Communicative competence. In the case of SLA, communicative competence is weighed far more over grammatical competence. In 1970, Del Himes defined communicative competence as knowing what to say to whom, when, and in what circumstances, i.e., the ability to use the language appropriately in different situations. Now, this is a tough enough task for native speakers, so this is especially challenging for English language learners. The provided reading includes a bunch of helpful examples of this, but I thought I would share an example of my own. So first off, some background about me. English is my native language. However, my ethnic origin is Chinese. When I worked as a university EFL instructor in China, I slowly acquired the language just for my day-to-day routine. While my Mandarin was improving gradually, I often ran into awkward situations from not having grasped the nuances of the language unique to their culture. When I taught in China, I got to know this secretary really well. She was the dean's secretary, and the dean was my boss. So basically, I communicated with my boss through the secretary. So we got to know each other pretty well. And so one day she was telling me a story. I don't remember what exactly, but I thought the story was pretty interesting. So I said, "Wow, that's crazy. You're crazy," for the situation. Now in English, crazy doesn't have this super serious meaning, you know? It's something you say just to kind of express that you're interested and you're surprised by their story. But when I said this to her, she got offended. She lashed back, said, "You can't call me that." So as you know, here in America, when you call someone crazy, it's not necessarily an insult. But when I said that to her, she was genuinely offended. So in our culture, you know, calling someone crazy isn't a big deal. But over there, it was a big insult. And it took a while before, you know, we became friends again. So the moral is that while I learned how to say these words correctly in Chinese, I wasn't using them properly in that social context. In that situation, I was grammatically competent, but not communicatively competent. Alright, so those are some of the key parts of the reading this week I wanted to emphasize. But there's a lot more to the chapter that will be useful, so make sure you read it through. The assignment this week is another discussion board post. This one is 3 questions. You should write at least a paragraph in response to each of these questions, and in your response post to appear. The idea is to instigate a meaningful dialogue. The discussion questions are: number 1, the authors talk about 4 social views of learning: the zone of proximal development, personal invention and social convention, spontaneous concepts versus scientific concepts, and cognitive apprenticeship. Among these 4 views, which one do you identify most with and why? Number 2, Noam Chomsky makes an important distinction in the study of language between competence and performance. Please talk about what competence and performance mean and what this distinction implies to teachers working with ELLs. And number 3, what is grammatical competence and what is communicative competence? What have you learned from these 2 types of competence? And also, don't forget to read your peers' posts and choose one to respond to. And that's it. This is due by 11:59 on 6/21/17. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. And here's a preview of Module 3. Next week, we will be continuing our exploration of second language acquisition. Have a great week, everyone.
When you're about to say something in another language, and it's easy to see in a language you don't speak very well, if you can put yourself in that position. When you come out with a sentence easily, it comes from what you've acquired, not from what you've learned.